This is the AYN Odin 2. It was the best handheld of 2023, according to me, and it came with a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor, 8 to 16GB of RAM, IPS 6-inch 1080p screen, video out, Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.3, USB-C, Android 13, an 8,000 mAh battery, active cooling, and back buttons, and it started at $299 US. This was an endgame handheld for most people. So naturally, they released a new one, a mini one. This is the AYN Odin 2 Mini. It comes with all of the same goodies as the Odin 2, except it's a much smaller handheld, much less weight, 38% less battery at 5,000 mAh, 5-inch mini LED 1080p screen, and no back buttons, starting at $339 US. So, is the Mini worth $40 more than the Odin 2? Let's talk about it. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Joey's Retro Handhelds. I'm Joey, and today we're going to be doing a deep dive review of the AYN Odin 2 Mini. This is a part 2 video. I did a first impressions video already that likely answers a lot of the initial questions that you have, so I would suggest watching that first and then jumping in here because I'm not going to rehash a lot of what I said in that video. There's just no reason to. So we're going to cover a lot of things that I didn't know in that video and I came to learn as I played with this more, and a whole bunch more. One thing to note, same as that video, the device that I have here is not the finished final shell or mold, which means if you're looking at it on screen, it is not what it's going to come with when it goes and ships to retail. It's supposed to have the same plastic as the Odin 2, so if that helps you make a decision. So just keep that in mind. As you're looking at it today, the shell, the mold, all of that is early preview and not exactly what it's going to be shipping with to consumers when you get it. Once again, AYN sent me this device for review, but they have no input in what I say, and they haven't seen this video ahead of time. The model that I have here is the 12GB Pro model, which retails for $399 US. The base model is 8GB and it retails for $339 US. I personally pre-ordered the white 12GB Pro, and I have that arriving with everybody else's whenever these ship at the end of this month. So after spending days and days and hours with this device, I can confidently and easily say that this is just an Odin 2 but mini. It's quite possibly the easiest thing I can do, and if you just want to end off here and close the video, you can, because that is all you need to know. It is that, but smaller. Simple. Now, if you're one of those that are here because you think it's an OLED display or like an OLED display or anything like that, this is not going to be the handheld for you. It has a really good display with some caveats that we'll talk about, but it's not an OLED. It is not that. So I know there's a bunch of people that have been waiting for an Odin 2 with an OLED. This is not what you're looking for. This is just a smaller, more portable Odin 2. And that is exactly how you should take this and look at it when you're watching today's video. So if you're here for a more pocketable, portable experience than the Odin 2 is, then you're in the right spot, because that's what it is. Throughout my week of playing this, I've personally found that I prefer this screen over the Odin 2s, with the obvious caveat being that the size difference between the two, because the Odin 2 is a 6-inch and this is a 5-inch. The brightness here goes up to 1100 nits, which I'm pretty sure, as you saw in my impressions video, makes it super hard to film next to another device when they're both at max brightness. But in person, the picture looks fantastic and it's not blown out at all, and I'm going to try and convey that through today's video. The Odin 2 can go up to 550 nits, which is half of what the Mini can do. And while the IPS panel still looks good, and I really like the one on the Odin 2, I really prefer the one on the Mini LED for pretty much every scenario. For example, if you're somebody that's going to be using this outside at all, the Mini LED would be your first choice. There's just no competition there, and I found myself touching grass a lot this week with just how enjoyable it is to use this display outside. I think the brightness and the clarity is something that can't be understated, but obviously there are some caveats, so let's talk about the two major ones. First, on the Odin 2, it has an IPS display, and a lot of people have seen that it has ghosting issues, which a lot of people have gotten used to over the time that you have the Odin 2. Now, on the Odin 2 Mini, it doesn't have that problem, and I've showed it off in the previous video and I'll show it off here again. There isn't any ghosting to be seen with this mini LED panel. So that's one caveat of the IPS that the mini LED overcomes. However, with the Odin 2 Mini and the mini LED display, two concerns are the vignetting and the blooming. On the vignetting side, I can happily say that while it definitely does exist, and I'm not going to shy away from telling you that it does, it disappeared as something that I noticed super quickly, and I would highly suggest enabling dark mode as it removes it almost completely from where it's noticed, and a lot of that is just the menu. Listen, that is not to say that it doesn't exist. It absolutely 100,000% exists. You will see vignetting. But it's something that isn't a deal breaker, at least to me, and I didn't find it to be a problem for enjoying this device. So once again, definitely present, definitely something that will show up throughout, and if it's something that bothers you, then obviously this is not going to be the device for you. But for everybody else, I'm telling you that as soon as you use this device and you stare at it normally, without weird angles that we have to film from and all of that, it is something that goes away, and you can get over it real quickly, because if you could get over Odin 2's ghosting, you could definitely do that with this. But I'm not going to tell you how to spend your money. If it's something that bothers you, then of course that is going to be a deal breaker for you. So maybe don't buy this, buy the Odin 2 or another handheld if that's what you want. So I mentioned it before, but the hard part about this display is filming it at the right angle, because if you go anywhere off that angle of where you would normally play this device and how you would normally look at it, that's where it starts to introduce a bunch of vignetting. As well, there is blooming present that I didn't find in my impressions video, but I noticed afterwards. So here's a quick example. If I put this screen down like this, and then if I were to somehow shrink and look down and tilt it like this, I can see definite signs of blooming, especially when I was using Solid File Explorer. It showed it right away and I could see it, but I would never ever play a device like this. It's like some AI generated image right there. So it's not a problem unless you were somehow going to play like this and you're like, I'm going to look at it this way and start playing it. That is the only time I've ever seen blooming on this display. For normal usage, just playing it as you would normally play a handheld, zero. I have not seen blooming. But if you go and turn it and you look at it from a certain angle, you'll see it. Point being, I don't think that should be a concern to anybody. I know there's a lot of people out there and a lot of people play things differently, but I have yet to meet anybody that plays devices like this. So there you go. One correction that I did want to make is that this panel actually does have HDR support. And I discovered it afterwards. Opened up the YouTube app, it works there. Opened up Plex, it works there. Tried it in Moonlight and it works, but Moonlight needs a whole bunch of different setting changes and all of that to get it to show properly. For me, it showed HDR, like the washed out section of it. So it's working, but to get it to show properly, you're gonna have to go and deep dive into sunshine and Moonlight settings and all of that. So can at least confirm it works there. What I can't confirm is that it works in RetroArch. For some reason, you're supposed to use Vulkan or OpenGL, didn't work for either. You're supposed to see a menu pop up with HDR. Didn't show up. So can't confirm, at least on the RetroArch part, that it shows, but I'm sure somebody smarter than me would probably figure that out. So as a kind of wrap up on all of this to deal with the screen, vignetting does exist. Blooming does exist at an angle. The screen gets super bright and it's really nice. The deal breakers are going to be vignetting. So if that is something that bothers you, then you're not going to like this. For everybody else, I think you're really going to like this panel when you see it in person. Now on the sound and audio front, I don't have many complaints about the Mini. Actually, I find the Odin 2s to be a little bit more hollow sounding than the Mini does, and I kind of prefer the Mini sound over the Odin 2. And I'm not sure how many people will agree with me on this, but let's have a quick listen to a few different samples so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. I think on either front, sound or audio shouldn't be a concern anyways. You might prefer one or the other, but both are good. Now, on the fan front, the Mini does in fact have coil whine and little bits of it, and you'll notice it completely different than the Odin 2. So let's do a side-by-side between the two so you can hear what I'm saying, and just keep an ear out for the Mini LEDs, little bits of coil whine that you can hear on sport mode at 100%. Now, one thing to keep in mind when it comes to the fan on this is you would most likely only be using it in really super high scenarios. Switch emulation, for example, or if you were gonna bunch of HD textures and then you're gonna go 4K display for GameCube or PS2 or something like that. But for normal usage, for anything else, you most likely don't have to turn on the fan at all. And with my Odin 2, I really never turn it on. It's on quiet mode forever, and I usually stick in performance mode. So just keep that in mind. The fan might be a concern if you turn it on, but you really never use it, at least in my experience. Now let's talk about the controls, and this is likely going to be one of those controversial statements, but I'm very, very, very happy that AYN decided to do stick up top instead of D-pad up top. And I know that's going to anger a lot of people, but one of my major complaints with the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro was the D-pad up top. It made it super uncomfortable for an already uncomfortable device. And while that device is still great in every other aspect, comfort is number one to me. And number two is having stick up top for a device that can play all of the systems that this can play. You definitely want that there. So I'm very happy to have it there. It made this a lot more comfortable. It's so much better to hold that way. And I didn't find it to be a concern, at least on my part, but if you're somebody who prefers D-pad up top, then obviously you have your own preferences. Now, before you kill me, I am somebody who is completely fine with the D-pad being bottom and using it for D-pad heavy games. For example, I use my Odin 2 for Game Boy Advance. That is probably my most played system on the Odin 2. And yeah, I'm using a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 to play Game Boy Advance. Sue me. But I did the same thing on the Odin 2 Mini because naturally that's probably what I'm going to play the most. And it is still fantastic to use. I don't have any issues with comfort, controls, ergonomics, or anything like that when I use the D-pad in the bottom spot. So I am a person that prefers having the D-pad being at the bottom and the sticks being at the top for a device like this. So keep that in mind. Now, for those unfamiliar with the controls on these two devices, they're the same from what I can tell, with the only difference that I could see being that the face buttons are slightly closer on the Mini than they are on the Odin 2. Now, that has resulted in my thumb hitting the right stick occasionally, and I know that's a deal breaker for a lot of people, so I want to mention it. But depending on how you play games, you might play it at a different angle than I do or hold it a little bit differently, but the way I hold it, I do find my thumb kind of hitting that right stick often. One thing I promised you at the end of my last video was checking to see if the buttons are physically swappable from the Xbox layout that they get delivered in to the Nintendo layout that probably most of us want. The answer is that no, they're not physically swappable as they're all keyed to the positions that they're in. It was also a pain to do so. 20 or so screws, 3 ribbon cables, 4 plugs, and so my sacrifice is your gain and knowledge. They're not swappable. So either way, as a recap, we have Hall sticks, analog triggers, nice clicky buttons, and on all 3 fronts they've been fantastic, which is expected since we've been using the same parts on the Odin 2 for months now. The sticks and the D-pad especially should be a standout for anybody that hasn't used them yet. Now, 2 parts that are new are the shoulders and the triggers. For anybody that has a Vita Slim, like I do, the shoulders on those are mushy and they tend to move back and forth just a little bit. On the Mini, they're clicky and they have that same amount of movement, but it feels a little bit more stiff than the Vita does, which just could be a years of use thing. On the triggers front, the Odin 2 has a much larger range of motion compared to the Mini. The travel on the Mini is just shorter, by a decent amount. In practice, I haven't found it to be a concern at all. It may be one of those things where you think of a really sensitive trigger game, and I mean really sensitive, but otherwise I haven't found the travel distance of the trigger to be a concern. Overall, continuing the theme of this is an Odin 2 but smaller, that's a recap on the controls. Just quickly on the ergonomics and controls front, I talked about it a bit in the last video, but I was preferring this device for comfort and ergonomics over things like the Retro Pocket 4 Pro or the Vita Slim or the Switch OLED, and all of those devices that have really flat backs and just make it not so comfortable. A lot of those devices I really need to use a grip for it to be comfortable. And I kind of shared through that video that I was preferring this because it had curves and bulkiness that it made it very comfortable to use, but that was a first impression. I'm happy to report that I've used this now for hours on end and I haven't had a concern, which means to me, this is actually super comfortable and ergonomic. So for anybody out there that has the similar feelings that I do when it comes to grips and those handhelds that I mentioned, you'll be very happy to know that this isn't that. This is very comfortable, and I'm happy to note that that is one thing that didn't change from my impressions at all. Fans of the channel know that comfort is one thing that I rate really highly. So for this to pass that test for me is a big thing, and I'm really happy that it does. I want to circle back on my video output testing for my impressions video, as you're going to recall that I said that audio wasn't working when I was doing video out testing. So I tested it again, and it worked just fine. No clue what I did during that impressions video to make it not work, but I'm happy to say that it wasn't a problem. It was just a Joey setup issue and probably because I was rushing to get that video out. Then we come to performance, and I fully understand that a lot of the times you guys just want to watch a video about somebody playing some video games on a device. And so I'm gonna keep this section in so you can see some video games being played on this device to give you an idea of what that looks like. But honestly, performance difference between the two is exactly the same. There is no difference that I found playing the Odin 2 and the Odin 2 Mini. So for anybody that wants to check out performance videos and complete performance videos, just find an Odin 2 video and it's going to be the exact same thing on the Odin 2 Mini. So what does that mean? It means the world is your oyster. Starting off with Game Boy Advance, just to show you how it scales and how great it looks here. I said it before, but Game Boy Advance is my most played system on my Odin 2, and now I have a new device to do that with. Yeah, I know, I'm using a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 to do this, but I can do that because it's mine. Next up is Nintendo DS, and this is such a hard system to emulate because you need a big enough screen to see both screens clearly, and for me, I need my retro achievements. This ticks both boxes, as you can adjust the sizes of both screens, but in either event, no issues playing DS or seeing DS. Nintendo 64 is up next, and I'm actually using Mupin, I don't even know how to say it, 64 Plus Next GLES 3 core here, and that's in RetroArch, and instead of using M64 Plus FZ, but we also have this upscaled to 1080p. This is my personal preference for retro achievements, but you should know that there are quite a few games that are broken using this core. As well, for it to work with front ends, you have to do some changes in RetroArch. So for anybody grabbing this or anybody using emulators on Android, you want to stick to M64 Plus FZ unless you really want retro achievements and you go down that rabbit hole. Sega Saturn is up next, and I'm just not a Sega person or a Sega Saturn person. I'm using the Beetle Saturn core here, and I booted up some Sega Rally, and it seemed to work perfectly fine. I imagine this will be a perfect system for Saturn. 3DS is up next, and I'm using Citra Canary here, and it's the same scenario as DS is. In this case, I set the internal resolution to 4x for default, but there are still going to be some games that need to be dropped a little bit to work. Overall though, you can have a really good time with 3DS, as long as you're okay with the occasional shader stutter and all of the usual caveats that come with 3DS. You're likely wondering, does this play Vita games? And the answer, like your teenage Facebook status, is it's complicated. Vita 3K, for lack of a better way to put this, is just not there yet. I can play Persona 4 Golden, and I can beat the game, and that'll work just fine. But there's a ton of other games that you likely want to play, but are broken compatibility-wise. Final Fantasy X freezes in the first 10 minutes. Ys, Memories of Calcutta? Don't correct me. Looks like somebody is pointing a sun on it. Other games won't boot, and other games have various issues, and so on. The actual playable games list of games that you likely want to play using this emulator is a bit on the low end. However, I did have a lot of fun playing Dragon's Crown, which seems to work just great. So it's just going to require some research on your end to see if what you want to play works on the Android version of Vita 3K. Then we come to the consoles that everybody wants to know about: GameCube, Wii, and PS2. Once again, they're all going to play perfectly here, upscaled and without concern. One added benefit of the Snapdragon here and the Adreno GPU is you can do a whole bunch of HD texture packs without concern, something that's a bit of a pain on a Mali GPU like the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. Add in 16:9 patches and everything else, and you have a really good device for GameCube, Wii, and PS2 emulation. Did you know that I did guides on all of this for HD texture packs and cheats and setting all this up, so check that out if you need it. But the point is that you can mostly just set GameCube and Wii to 1080p and forget it, and off to the race you go just playing some games. For PS2, there's still some games that just don't emulate properly, and you're going to have major dips or require some tweaking. But thanks to the processor, you can brute force a lot of the catalog here with just the power that you have, and there's just no better experience than booting up some games and having them just run out of the box. Just know what you're getting into with PS2 emulation on Android and the state of compatibility with it. Lastly, we have Nintendo Switch, and for obvious reasons, we're not going to spend a lot of time here. But I have a long video on Switch performance that you can check, and it was before they added native code execution, so it's only gotten better. You can check that for more reference, but as long as the emulator has compatibility for it, the game will run and it'll run at full speed. That's the easiest way that I can condense it all, while saying that obviously there is still a bunch of Switch titles that have compatibility issues, so don't expect full compatibility. And so, like my Odin 2 review that I did so long ago, I'm going to end off the performance conversation by saying anything that you want to play that works on Android will work on this device. The limit to what this can do is still emulator progress. So as soon as that changes, you have a device that can play really anything that you want, which means that you would be set for emulation with this device for a long while because of the state of things on Android. Let's talk about battery and thermals now, since I made a promise to you back in my impressions video that I would tie it all back in my review. You might recall that we only did a single battery test for Switch because I didn't have a lot of time to do the rest. And with the Mini lasting about 1 hour less than the Odin 2, but mind you, with a much higher nits brightness at about double what the Odin 2 can do, we were curious to see how the rest of the test would go. Now, I don't see much use in matching brightness, nit for nit, for a battery test, since you don't buy a Ferrari to drive it in a school zone. But I did do one test of 0% brightness, and all of the rest the same for Switch, and the Mini got 268 minutes. That means that the display is using up 100 minutes of battery life. Theoretically, that would also mean that at 50% brightness, the Mini should be right up there competing with the Odin 2 by only a few minutes off. However, that story changes a little bit with the other emulators for some reason. So, looking at the rest of the numbers, GameCube emulation, using the performance mode preset, Odin 2 was 368 minutes, and remembering again that this is a full 100 to 0% battery test, Wi-Fi is on, Bluetooth is off, 100% brightness on both, 10% audio, and fan is on sport mode. The Mini, in comparison, was 260 minutes, about 100 minutes off once again from the Odin 2. Ran the same exact tests for Nintendo 64 emulation, using the standard mode preset, and the Odin 2 was 520 minutes, and the Odin 2 Mini was 284 minutes. So what does this all mean? And this might be above my pay grade, but the only thing that I can guess is that at 100% brightness, the panel is using so much power that it is completely killing that battery. So it's a bit of a trade-off here because the panel looks fantastic and you want it to look at 100% brightness because that's the best that it looks, but you're going to give up some battery, it seems. From that test that I did for the 0% brightness on Switch, you can see that 100 minutes of that was due to the panel, which means for the other tests, probably similar stats and percentages. And so the only thing that I can point to is that the display is doing that, And so you're going to give up some battery if you want to deal with a more portable handheld like this. And this might not matter to you if you're going to be lowering the brightness a little bit more. But also remember again that these are very worst case scenarios. For example, nobody is using the fan on sport mode to play Nintendo 64. And you usually don't even need to do that for GameCube emulation. So on smart mode and normal brightness and all of the other things, I'm pretty sure this is going to do a lot better on battery. But I wanted to show you the worst case scenarios so you have that in mind. On the thermals front, you'll recall that I did a bulk of the testing here already, and I can confirm that my findings really didn't change at all during the week. The Mini does get slightly warmer than the Odin 2 at earlier points than the Odin 2 does, and it does get roughly about 10 or so Celsius hotter according to the temperature the device reports. But the entire device still stays relatively cool. I think that AYN can adjust the fan curves to apply a higher percentage speed a little bit earlier to combat this, but it's one of those things where I think most of you will just feel it and then just chalk it up to my Canadian hands feeling warmth for the first time. It doesn't get hot, and so from a thermals perspective, I'm actually happy to report that I didn't find it to be a concern. Okay, so let's tie everything all together into a price conversation and a use conversation. First up, you have to remember that we are talking about what was labeled as the best handheld of 2023, at least by me and a lot of others, and we have the same exact device but smaller here. So my point being that when we are talking about these two devices right now, we are very much nitpicking between the two because this is kind of the top of the Android game when it comes to devices. So if you want a very general way to look at it, do you want a smaller Odin 2? And if so, this is it. If you could deal with the ghosting on the Odin 2, you can deal with the vignetting on this Odin 2 Mini LED. But there's also many other use cases. Do you want to use this outside? Mini LED. Are you primarily at home? Odin 2. Are you worried about screen size at all? Odin 2. Do you want something that's more pocketable and portable? Mini. If you have a Retroid Pocket 4 Pro and you wanted a lot more power and maybe just a better device, Mini. And so you can start to see where I'm going with this. There is no one answer here, and these are just two different use cases. Odin 2 for a lot of different scenarios and Mini for a lot of different scenarios. I don't think you can go wrong with either of them, and it'll just be up to you on what you're looking for. Now, the very big caveat here is the price, and the Mini LED's price just doesn't make sense to me. Currently, it comes with a free bag and a screen protector for $40 more up until June 21st, and then that goes away, the free bag and screen protector. So anytime after June 21st, you are losing value with this purchase compared to that. It's going to cost you $40 more compared to the base to order this, and you are losing battery life, you're losing the back buttons, and you're having a different panel to use. So you're kind of losing a lot of value there in that $40. And so I'm going to have to add in one more use case here, and that is best bang for your buck. And the answer for that is going to be the Odin 2, 1000%. Best bang for your buck if you care about the money and you don't care about size and all of that, buy the Odin 2. It is a better value purchase, it makes more sense and all of that. The Mini to me is going to be a niche use case purchase. For anybody that just needs something portable and pocketable, all that sort of thing, you have the Mini, but you're going to pay for that privilege by a few dollars more. And so we come to the point of the video where I talk about my personal thoughts and what I'll be doing. And I mentioned it earlier, but I ordered a Mini White Pro 12GB model, and I paid the full $400 US, which is like $1 million Canadian dollars to me. And so that is my own money. I could at this point choose to cancel that. However, I very much prefer the Mini to the Odin 2. And again, not saying the Mini or the Odin 2 is bad at all. I just much prefer a smaller, more pocketable handheld like this. It just fits my use cases a lot more, especially since I can just throw this in a sling bag and have a lot more room for other things. I could do that with the Odin 2, but obviously it's a lot bigger. So for me, the panel is fantastic, the size is great, power is obviously there, all of that is there. And so my going forward device is going to be the Odin 2 Mini, the white one, whenever it arrives. So as a very quick wrap up for a too long didn't watch, you can't go wrong with either device. If you want a smaller one, grab this. If you want a bigger one, grab this. That's it. Don't forget to like and sub to help the channel grow. Come join me on the Discord to talk about all these handhelds. Support me on Patreon if you like my videos, and hope you all have a good one.